So greetings, hello. This is Dr. Thomas Daffen. I'm recording a little short talk here for the World Parliament of Religions in Toronto. I'm sending you love and greetings from France and from Europe. I myself am a dual Canadian citizen, so I'm very proud of the fact that we're hosting this conference. Religious leaders from all over the planet have come together in Toronto. I've listened to some of the short broadcasts, particularly from the Indigenous Spiritualities Working Group, and I was very impressed. And because I can't be there physically at the moment, I thought I'd be there, as it were, intellectually by sending you some ideas and thoughts that hopefully people at Toronto will find of interest if you manage to hear them in time, and other people that can't be there from around the world. I've been involved in interfaith work myself for quite a long time. I was Secretary General for the World Conference on Religion and Peace in Britain and Ireland and sat on the European Committee. Attended the World Conference in Rome at the Vatican in 1995 and have been involved in interfaith peace work ever since. I run an intellectual gathering of scholars looking at the philosophical dimensions of peacemaking called the Institute of Peace Studies and Global Philosophy. And I'm coordinator of Philosophers of Peace in Europe. So my remarks are going to be aimed really at the intellectual wing of the interfaith movement. Every religious tradition on the planet has its philosophical stream. So Jain, Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, etc., indigenous and so on. So I'm interested in the philosophical commonalities between all these different faith streams. What I experienced in interfaith peace diplomacy, there wasn't enough discourse at that level. It was much more basic, and that's important too. How do you pray, how do you celebrate, which gods do you worship, what rituals do you do? That kind of basic discourse is important. But what I'm interested in, and what I'll be sharing here, is a more metaphysical, more philosophical approach to interfaith discourse. Now, I've been working for the last 10, 15 years as a teacher of comparative religion and philosophy in Britain and Europe. And so my remarks will be based on that educational experience as well. The first thing is we need some kind of map to understand where all these religions and philosophies come from and how they've evolved. In the Spirituality Working Group at Toronto, you have a indigenous spiritualities theme, spiritual evolution. And that interests me very greatly. It's something I've been working on, both personally and professionally for many years. And I've come up with a map, a table, which hopefully will be of interest to people there in Toronto if you've not come across it. It's called the Periodic Table of the World's Religious and Philosophical Traditions. It comprises the different colour-coded categories of faith traditions on the planet. And I've written this and devised this as an objective historian of religions and philosophies. So the light green colour is the ancient shamanic, pagan and primal traditions, which include the Native American, but also the ancient Egyptian, the Celtic Druidical traditions, the Norse traditions, the Etruscan, the ancient Roman, the ancient Greek. All the pagan traditions are here in the light green. Now those are the earliest, historically, out of which all the other later religious traditions evolved. So the very first ones had no writing systems. We're talking the people of Magdalenian culture in Europe here, not far from me, in the Dordogne region. They found caves with paintings and some kind of obviously advanced consciousness. People were working with shamanic traditions and so on, out of which later Druidry and the Norse and ancient European traditions evolved. And two Canadians have actually done a PhD on studying the Paleolithic script that appears in these cave paintings, which is very interesting, from Vancouver. I wonder if they're there at this wonderful conference in Toronto, if so, hello. And then you've got all the other ones that have evolved, right? After writing is invented, in Sumeria and Egypt, more or less simultaneously, and a bit later in China, the different written scripts then begin to codify the spiritual teachings of mankind, and we enter the age of literacy. And it creates the illusion that they are separate teachings. I think when cultures worked at the oral level, indigenous cultures are oral transmissions, right? And at that level, it's much easier for a priest or priestess who's been initiated in one tradition to travel halfway around the world and know what the other person's working on, and to resonate with them, because they're working from nature-based spirituality, earth-based spirituality. They're working with the animals, the plants, the interconnectedness of consciousness between the individual ego and the cosmic self, which has been, is transparent. It's a transparent membrane. And consciousness travels from cosmic down to micro, as a kind of, as it says in the Bible, when the angels go up and down the ladder, and Jacob is looking at this and thinking, wow, I think that's what he's experiencing, this simultaneity of different levels, from the cosmic to the microcosmic. So I would go so far as to say that all the spiritual teachings of mankind are actually indigenous. The Judaic tradition is the indigenous spirituality of the Jewish people who were there in that particular extraordinary part of the Middle East. The Arabian traditions that become Islam are the indigenous spirituality of that region. The early Christian teachings of Christ and his innermost disciples, Mary Magdalene, Thomas, John, the closest disciples, not the political figureheads like Peter who became important later, but the innermost core of Gnostic early Christians. They were the indigenous spirituality of the ancient Canaanite culture, which had close links to the Phoenicians and to that universal spirituality that they represented, and so on and so on. So I think it's very exciting. Anyway, here's a map. It includes the Persian religions, like the Zoroastrian tradition, but also the Manichaean and others, and then new religious movements are in there. It's a very universalist map, and also in the light yellow at the bottom we have the philosophical traditions, things like Pythagoreanism, Platonism, Aristotelianism, Kantianism, Hegelianism, and so on. So it's a useful map, and I wish that every delegate at the World Parliament of Religions had got this in your pack. It would help to navigate, right? Here are the Buddhist ones. Again, there are different categories of Buddhism. There's the Theravadin, the Mahayana. I've also coined the word meta-Mahayana, which is like the sort of Californian Gary Snyder Buddhism, Ken Wilber type, universal salvation through any vehicle. In a sense, all these religious traditions are vehicles, yanas, and we can work through any. If you're born a Jew or born a Christian, you can still reach enlightenment. You don't have to become a Buddhist. That's the meta-Mahayana position. Here's the Jewish ones. Again, you have the Orthodox, conservative, Kabbalistic, even the Samaritan, although there's only a few, they're an important and noble tradition. So I've tried here, and the Chinese, of course, Confucianist, Taoist, and so on, to provide a map for interfaith discourse based on my own research, studies, and teaching. And this is really useful for teaching with. You can do a whole curriculum. You can do like a master's degree based just on this table. It should be in every religious studies department around the planet, every mosque, synagogue, gurdwara, school, particularly the more academic centres for studies. Also the Jain are here, the Sikh and the Shinto. Basically nothing's left off. There are a few details that need tweaking, but it's there. It's also on a website. So that's my first gift to you in Toronto, is have a look at that, use it, take it away as a teaching device. And as a device to further intellectual discourse. On the website and the book that goes with it, you've got the list of all the deities in the tradition. So each deity, tradition, Shinto, whatever, I've listed all the major kami, which is the name for the gods in Japanese. And the same with all the other traditions, like the Celtic pantheons and the Etruscan or the Roman or the Greek or the ancient Egyptian. Now, I want to address one of the problems, because to do with the Middle East, I'm a chair of a thing I've set up called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East. And one of the reasons I haven't come back to Canada, I miss Canada, I wish I was there, but I came back to Europe to help prevent World War III. Having lived in Canada in the 1970s and early 80s, I felt a kind of moral duty to come back and be here in Europe, because it's the epicenter of World War I and World War II. I'd been nursing Canadian soldiers in a veterans Federal Army hospital in Calgary for 3 years, and I'd learned about the horrors of World War I and World War II from them. And they said, Thomas, you're wasted here in Calgary, go back to Europe and stop World War III. So I came back, I did a degree, I studied at the University of London, and I created a Peace Studies Institute, which I'm still director of, at London. I then taught in Oxford, and I worked in academia as a peace educator. And the epicentre of the problems we're now facing, I think, has shifted from Europe. I don't think there's going to be a World War III breaking out in Europe. Yes, there are problems. There's conflict spots in the Balkans. There's friction areas in Ukraine. There's a serious problem going down that needs mediating. I've proposed creating a European Union mediation service officially. I'm working with colleagues on that. But I think the real problem is the Middle East. We have a serious catastrophe going on in Syria, which is still not solved. We have a tragedy in Yemen that is unbelievably horrendous, famine victims and so on. We have the never-ending, constant problem of Israel-Palestine, how to solve this, how to square the circle, how to get justice for both Israelis and Palestinians. And other conflicts that have arisen out of that. We've got posturing between Saudi Arabia and Israel, making a very strange alliance, but basically run from the USA, against Iran. But why suddenly is everyone so much against Iran? Iran has its own indigenous spirituality, Zoroastrianism, and Shiism, which is its incredible take on Islam. And if you study Islam, as I have, Shiism isn't something to be afraid of. It's a very extraordinary tradition. And Sayyid Hussein Nasr, who's the great Iranian professor of history of science at Harvard, has written more books about history of Shiism than anyone else I know. I've met him. The Iranian spiritual tradition is genius, actually, and holds part of the key of peacemaking. Mullah Sadra, the greatest philosopher of Iran, was an ontologist on the level of Aristotle. He combined global philosophical studies with Shiism. We should be having discourses at that level instead of posturing and threatening to bomb each other or withdraw sanctions. It's complete nonsense. What I've been trying to do through my own institute is bring together the greatest philosophers in these different traditions to discourse. And fundamentally, eventually we have to agree, like Sir Isaac Newton, that we don't know the final ultimate truth of reality. We need some intellectual humility here. So that I may be a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or a Buddhist, but I have to suspend judgment on my ultimate truth claims. Therefore, I have to tolerate and allow you to have some truth too. Okay? And we have to learn each other's languages. So here's the thing, right? Each of the boxes has its own linguistic system. I can't fully comprehend Shiism unless I learn Persian, unless I learn to read, the Shia epics in their Persian language. And the same with all the others, Pali, Hebrew, Sanskrit, Chinese, etc. So one of my gifts that I've done is I've compiled an interfaith philosophical dictionary in which I put the big words like God, goddess, peace, love, truth, into all their different indigenous languages. So Armenian has just come in, Basque. I'm hoping we'll get Hawaii there soon. Because unless we understand each other's languages, we're going to look at each other with total incomprehension. So let's put the guns down, put the bombs away, stop investing in nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction, stop investing in cyber warfare, and start investing in intellectually, proactive peace fair. Let's study each other's philosophical systems in their linguistic originals. And let's realise that what the Hebrew tradition means by Elohim, can be married up with what the Arabic tradition means by Allah. The 99 names of God in the Arabic Sufi tradition, can be mapped with the Kabbalistic Sephiroth, the 10 Sephiroth. I've done that. You can choreograph the systems. You can then marry that up with the Christian idea of the divine names, which you get in the wonderful works of Dionysius the Areopagite, great mystical Christian, which influenced Western and Eastern Christians for many, many centuries. And, nobody knows the real names of God, right? That's why you can't actually say the word. It's a paradox. Like the Taoists say, the Tao you can name isn't the real Tao. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't try. The philosopher's job is to try and name the impossible, knowing always that we can never fully name it, right? But that's why we should come together in humility and love. I've also launched a journal of love studies, because to me philosophy means the love of wisdom. Until we learn to love wisdom, we're going to be in the outer courts of Gnosis, right? In the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, you weren't allowed into the inner courts unless you were kind of initiated into the inner core of the tradition. And you weren't allowed into the Holy of Holies unless you were the high priest for that time. Well, I think that's a metaphor, it's a teaching. We won't get into the inner court unless we understand the nature of love. And we won't get into the Holy of Holies until we actually actualize that. Not just individually, but collectively as groups. If each tradition actualized the true loving kindness within its heritage, we'd be home and dry, the planet would be saved, right? But unfortunately, what's happened is the true intellectuals, the sages, and I've seen this happening, even in interfaith work, right, are kind of elbowed out by the pushy ones that come forward who don't have the love, but have the love of power. So the external hierarchs of this or that faith tradition push their way to the front of the interfaith dialogue, jamboree, and back home they're the ones whipping up the military, the youth, to hate the other. So that the so-called religious leaders often become the voice of, yes, well, we're X, we don't like Y. Yes, we must train and defend ourselves against borders, against Y. And this is going on all over the planet, and it just has to stop. It's completely ridiculous, because philosophically it makes no sense, right? Except you can explain it sociologically, that in every group dynamic, the bullies usually come to the fore. We all know that from playground studies and what goes on in crowd behaviour and so on. Well, spirituality is supposed to be a remedy against that. Right? So by going against that stream, which comes down through our genetic evolution, the sort of dinosaur genes in us all, right? If you counter that through a life of reflection, introspection, spiritual inner work, you transcend those ego states of, I've got to be best, I've got to be first, I want to be the one, to after you. It's sort of the politeness code kicks in. And then compassion becomes the dominant theme, and love, which is mutuality. So I'm suggesting that we in the interfaith movement fast forward to that phase. I'm hoping that you in Toronto, you're probably already doing it, and I wish I was there. But I think there are several things. Firstly, the monotheist faiths have to stop their carve-up of the planet and their complete disregard for the polytheist or indigenous peoples. Right, so what we have is the monotheist faiths, Christianity, Islam, Judaism. They sort of act as if their God is the only God, right? And because they're in competition with each other for which God it is it the God of Christianity or Islam or Judaism, we have an insoluble problem in the Middle East. And speaking on behalf of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East, as chair, I'm now reporting back to the Interfaith Parliament in Toronto that conflict will be insoluble till the monotheist traditions loosen up and do some serious intellectual homework on their own pagan, primal and indigenous roots. Now, I've done some of the work for you. I've done a commentary on the Quran, on the 6 Gospels, including the Gnostic Gospels of Thomas and Mary Magdalene, and also on the Ketuvim, the Jewish scriptures, the wisdom writings. I haven't finished, it's all, don't know if I'll live long enough, because these are really, really detailed academic, but also spiritual and transpersonal analyses of these texts, right? And what I can report is that they all come from the same kind of transpersonal ground. The wisdom that's in the Jewish writing, or the Islamic, or the Christian, is coming from a common, universal, pre-existing, primordial tradition, which is universal in that region. Actually, they're members of the same family group. I then went on and did a commentary on the 3 books of Enoch. The book of Enoch, the first one, is in the Ethiopian Bible. It was studied in Qumran. Many scraps of the book of Enoch were found among the Essenes, who were Jewish mystics operating around the time of John and Jesus. And it's been known about in the early Christian tradition, because in the New Testament it's quoted, the book of Enoch. So by studying the book of Enoch, we can find something of that commonality. Enoch was a prophet that came between Adam and Noah. in the interval. He's mentioned briefly in the Orthodox Old Testament, but in the Ethiopian Old Testament, his actual book is there, and it describes an extraordinary experience. He's transported to heaven by an archangel. He's taken up out of body and transported through these higher worlds, and he sees the mysteries of creation. He's taught by God directly how the universe came into being and how we humans are supposed to be behaving to each other. He's then sent back down to Earth to relay this information to the locals in that part of the world, in Mesopotamia. And then at the end, he is taken back up to heaven. Okay, that's the first book of Enoch, which is an extraordinary thing. The second book of Enoch begins where that one finishes, and it was written almost around the same time as Christ was teaching. And it's 100% certain Christ was steeped in these Enochian writings. He certainly knew the first book of Enoch, because one of the phrases that keeps coming up in the book of Enoch is that Enoch is identified as the Son of Man. This means like a collective representative of the archetype of humanity. Kabbalists call it Adam Kadmon. He's the Adam Kadmon of his era. And Enoch was of his era. Enoch was the Adam Kadmon of that early, almost pre-patriarchal period. And then Jesus is, I think, having read all this stuff and studied, he was an intense esoteric student. He said, okay, well, somebody's got to play this role. I'll be the Enoch of our era. And as his teachings were coming out in such profundity, and people were thinking, wow, this guy's something. So who are you? They'd say, well, I'm just the Son of Man. That's a code for anyone that knows the text to say, I'm the Enoch of this era. Anyways, the second book is beautiful, and it has so many passages that are so similar to Christ's own teachings, like the Beatitudes. The second book of Enoch is full of Christ's own language, like happy will they be who live a life of righteousness, who pursue truth, who pursue love. It's as if either Christ has been reading this text, or he's been thinking the same thoughts because he's been sitting at the feet of the people that were writing it. Scholars are still debating, who influenced who. It's fascinating. I've done a detailed commentary on it, you can listen to it. The point is that these scriptures belong to neither just the Christians, nor just the Jews, nor just the Muslims, because the third book of Enoch is written in Hebrew. It's a few centuries after, and it reports a Rabbi Ishmael, who was a historical figure. We know he actually existed. He was an important mystic, and he's mentioned in the Jewish writings. He himself had one of these out-of-body journeys, and he went to the heaven world, and he managed to interview Enoch, who's now in heaven. He's become God's scribe and right-hand man, who's in charge of the scrolls. When you die and go to heaven, he does the paperwork. And that's what Enoch is now. And Rabbi Ishmael goes to see him and talks to him, and is utterly blown away by the mysteries that Enoch reveals to him. And Rabbi Ishmael comes back down and shares it with anyone that will listen. And that text is foundational to the whole later Kabbalistic mysteries of esoteric Judaism, right? So what I said in my commentaries is that we should all be studying these books, whether we're Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, or whatever, also pagan, because the irony of this whole thing is Enoch himself, if you met him and said, hello, Enoch, what religion are you? He would have said, he'd look at the chart, he'd say, well, I'm with the light greens, I'm a pagan. Because Enoch lived at a time before the later alphabetic revelatory systems were differentiated, when it was an oral transmission, okay? And he was a priest, it's thought, of Sumeria. The archetype on which Enoch is based, and comes down into the biblical canon, is thought to be based on a priest of the sun god, who may well have been a historical figure in ancient Sumeria, about whom stories were told that he'd gone to heaven and seen God, right? And then, of course, later, like Chinese whispers, it all gets transmuted into what we have now. In Islam, Enoch is revered also as a prophet. Muhammad himself had heard of Enoch. He called him Idris. And in the Quran, he's mentioned several times as one of the wisest men who'd ever lived, right? And Muhammad saw himself in the lineage of Enoch, Moses, Abraham, Jesus, the whole line, as just transmitting the latest revelations, right? Where I think we're at then, and I'm sort of speaking as coordinator of philosophers of peace here, to the interfaith community, is the interfaith leaders have to do their philosophical homework, realise there is this bigger context of unity from which we all come, tell the kind of war thinkers to put their guns down, and to pick up their pens. The wonderful hadith of Muhammad, the ink of the scholar is worth more than the blood of the martyr. Right? We have to pick up our pens and encourage the young lads who are out there blowing each other up. And now they're all on the internet, hacking and sending worms to each other. You have to pick up the pen and study these amazing esoteric wisdom teachings that belong to the whole of the planet. They're not the ownership property of anyone. They belong to us all. Now, other things that I wanted to share from a Canadian perspective, the indigenous traditions of Canada and America. I just want to say thank you for Deganawidah. For those people that are in Toronto, indigenous people will have heard of Deganawidah, but he was a great peace leader of the indigenous peoples of North America who brought the message of peace before the white man ever came. Probably lived in about the 1300s of European time. And he managed to get the 5 tribes together into a federation so that they agreed to mediate their conflicts and not go on the warpath. They put the tomahawks down and agreed to sit around the council fire and discuss things till they were solved. Deganawidah is one of, he deserves to stand with Moses and Abraham and Jesus and Buddha as one of the great peace teachers of humanity, in my opinion. And the fact that he was a native North American Indian spiritual elder, I think, is so important. That's why your tradition is so important, and why in Toronto, the fact that you are hosting this World Parliament of Religions is epochal. I would like to see that wisdom of Deganawidah taken up in Europe. That's why I'm trying to get a European Union mediation service going. In Britain, which is still struggling, does it want Brexit, doesn't it, what's its identity? They need to get their act together and sort out a federal constitution like we have in Canada. The British have to stop kind of weighting the system towards Westminster and London and the English, and have to accept that the Irish, the Welsh, the Scottish have equal rights and equal voices. They need a new federal constitution, and a written constitution, in my opinion, like Canada has, which would then enable them to stay inside the European Union and work out a federal Europe, so that instead of being afraid of the concept of federalism, I think we should realise its spiritual rootedness. It comes from the Latin fidere, meaning faith. Canada's a federal country, which means, yes, I'm from Alberta or British Columbia, I love my province, but I also respect and honour the federal government in Ottawa, because they speak for the whole nation, right? That's Deganawidah's idea. We're each a different tribe, but we respect the federal council, where the elders of all tribes gather to debate weighty matters of war and peace and justice. Usually it was the women elders that spoke in the council. And they spoke from all 4 directions. They didn't just bifurcate right-left, like European politics. They spoke from north, south, east and west. They spoke from all 4 directions. And they spoke from each of the 4 qualities of spirit that those 4 directions represent: earth, fire, air and water. We all have all 4 elements. And so any problem that arises should be addressed from all 4 directions. That's the politics of indigenous Canadian and North American spirituality. That's the politics, if you want, of peace that Deganawidah proposed. And I'm 100% supportive of that. I'm speaking here also on behalf of the Druids of Europe and Britain. I'm the peace Druid, peace elder of the Druid community of Britain, and now Europe. And the indigenous Celtic traditions are almost identical with the indigenous North American traditions. And just as these monotheistic religions have thought, they have the thunder, they have the fire, and they have the truth, in suppressing the native wisdom, be it in North America or elsewhere in the world, in Africa or here in Europe, the very wisdom that they need to create peace has been lost. So this recovery of the ancient wisdom paths is part of this peacemaking. And I'm glad to see the Parliament of Religion has got a whole track on spiritual evolution for indigenous people. I hope there's some Druids and Hermeticists from the Fellowship of Isis and other pagan traditions, the runic colleagues from the north of Europe will be there, and pagan traditions from all over the planet, because their voice is the one that can also lead us to peace and reconciliation. I want to end with a couple more calls. So one of the things is what can intellectuals of the planet do? I've been involved in a new project from India to create a World Intellectual Forum. There is this Davos conference every year, the World Economic Forum, which meets, and it jets in all the kind of top economists and business leaders and politicians. I don't think it's working. The world is seriously suffering from unemployment, from ongoing conflict, from poverty. The figures of poverty around the planet are horrendous. Many people don't know where they're going to sleep tomorrow, where their meal's going to come from. And yet the military intelligence elites have no problems. They have huge amounts of security. They have jobs for life. And all they have to do, they have a kind of incentive to cause the occasional war now and then, just to justify the huge expenditure on weapons. The world is spending $1.7 trillion a year on military weapons and paying for these soldiers to strut around and fire guns at each other. That's what I'm addressing as Peace Druid of Europe. And on behalf of my brothers and sisters in Toronto, we have to stop this, okay? So how do we stop it? It seems impossible. Peace studies has been going since the 60s. It's not working. The wars are continuing, right? Last May, we had a symposium here at this wonderful European Peace Museum in France for Leonardo da Vinci, who was one of the great geniuses of European and Renaissance history, an Italian, who was not just a painter and an artist, he was also a sculptor, a musician, a poet, a polymath, or polysavant, right? And we had a conference here, and then we went to Amboise, where he's buried. The King of France invited him to come and live here for the last few years of his life. Now, I communed with his spirit when we went to the graveside, and I talked to him in spirit. Now, my spiritual brothers and sisters will know what I'm talking about here. And Leonardo was forced in his life to work for some pretty nasty military types because he needed a job, right? So he actually worked for Cesare Borgia, who was the son of the Pope, a fierce warlord in Italy. He worked for the Sforza dynasty in Milan. And he was forced, because of his circumstance, to design instruments of war. He designed, effectively, the first helicopter, the first submarine, the first machine gun, things like this. But, he didn't want to do all that. He was a peace lover, right? You can tell from the way he paints his women so beautifully. He was a lover of beauty and eros and the divine elements of that. But he had to make a living, so he had to do war. Now, it occurred to me as I was communing with the spirit of Leonardo that that's the situation on the planet now. So many brilliant inventors, internet geeks, geniuses are having to do the Leonardo thing, sell themselves out to the military. They're working for the Pentagon, for the MI6, for the MI5, for the MOD, for the French equivalents, all over the world, Russian military and so on. Some of the brightest minds on the planet, the Leonardos, are working for these military things. And it's their job, their mortgage, their family, it's their school fees for their kids and so on. We're never going to stop this gravy train until we think of a way of exciting the highest intellectuals and scientists on the planet to see that peace is the greatest duty of the real intellectuals, not militarism. Actually, anybody can invent weapons. It's not difficult. Solving really complex conflicts is much more challenging intellectually. So mediating, resolving conflicts,